And it's a very good morning to Mike. How are you this morning, Mike?
Good morning, Terry. Good, thanks.
Bit moist around here, isn't it?
Yes, nice to see a little drop of rain.
Very
it's
welcome.
A long time since the wiper switch was touched.
It worked, did it?
It did. Oh, of course. Yes, it's British and it worked perfectly.
Oh, excellent.
We'd like to welcome Paul Markham. Paul's come up once again as a guest.
Good morning. Hello, everybody.
Good morning to you, Mike.
We're going to talk briefly about the classic car show and also the original Percy Markham car collection here in Perth. Just like to mention a couple of things that are happening locally. Last weekend we had the Ace Ford run. That finished up at Pickering Brook, and my roving reporter tells me there were about 400 cars on that run. So obviously the Ace Ford Club did a good job and it was very well attended.
Very good. That's a good turnout.
It is a good turnout, yes. There's not much happening this weekend as far as I'm aware. Next weekend is a long weekend, and we'll be here next Saturday on the 29th, and on the 2nd of March, which is the Monday. Do not go on the Sunday. On the Monday, the 2nd of March, there's the Veteran Car Club display of motor cars. From spanning a range from 1905 to 1995. There'll be veteran, vintage, classic and military vehicles on display. It's free entry. It's part of the Rotary Park Fair, and that's on both Sunday and Monday, the Rotary Park Fair, but the VCC display of cars is on the Monday the 2nd. So do go along and check us out. And there's a bit of shade down there, I believe, and a few other things happening in addition to just cars.
Now, Michael, you say it's the Rotary Park Fair. It's not the Hyde Park Fair.
Well, I'm just going by the spiel that was sent to me by our VCC contact,
well, what
Leslie.
Can you say? I can't say any more than that, can I? I bow to their superior knowledge.
That's what they're promoting it as. So
okay.
We'll trust them on that.
Okay.
Just moving out one more week, we've got the Classic Car Show at Ascot Racecourse on Sunday, March the 8th. And we'll talk a little more about that shortly. And on the same day, there's a hot rod.
Get me to shut up.
Rod rumble down at Ravenswood. So for those of you with hot rods that like a country run, that's finishing up down at Ravenswood Hotel. I think that's where the display is going to be. And just going to mid-March, we've got the Charger Club of WA putting on their Super Cruise. It starts in Belmont. It goes out to Caversham, finishes at the Motor Museum in Whiteman Park, and you can visit their website, chargerclub.asn.au. And indeed, we'll have Paul Monkhouse up here next Saturday on KCR 102.5 for Round the Bend, and he will be promoting a new book on West Australian Chryslers and Valiants. So just one other thing I'd like to mention was a local auction. It's in the wheatbelt town of Corrigan, and that's on the 7th of March, which is a Saturday. The address is 15 Cam Street, CAMM, and it's stationary engines, including a shearing plant, lathes and milling machines, a working windmill pump. There's a lot of stationary engines on offer, and this particular gentleman, he has to sell up and downsize for family reasons. I have seen the collection, and it's well worth viewing if you're into that stationary engine scene, and you can view online asktony.com.au, asktony.com.au.
And what you saw the collection, Mike?
I was up there visiting a family member, and he knows the gentleman concerned, and he showed us his collection a few months ago now.
Very pleasant motor cars, are they?
No cars, no, just stationary engines and machinery.
Yeah,
but it's a very impressive collection. I'm going to hand over to Paul now and not hog the microphone all morning. Thanks for coming up, Paul, and perhaps we'd like to talk about that original car collection here in Perth.
Okay, should we start with that?
Yes.
Yes, why not? Okay, so The name Markham does get this question
Well, it
raised
does.
several times.
Jenny in front of your warship. So
I don't know where you're going with that one, Tony. Terry, sorry. Sorry, I was just thinking it.
Can call me Tony if you want.
Ask Tony. Yes, so I get asked quite a lot about what's my relationship with the Markhams, the famous Markhams with the car collection. Percy Markham was my grandfather's brother, and he began, interestingly enough, when he had a young family, he decided he wanted to teach them mechanical skills at home. So he found himself a Morris Cowley, which is
as you do,
that was kind of a bit of a wreck. And as a family project, they rebuilt the car and restored it around the kitchen table. So this is a story.
Understanding wife?
Understanding wife, yes, yeah. They had a bit of money. They were, I think, into real estate development.
Aren't they all? Aren't they all into money?
Yeah, well, yes, you need a bit of money, money and time. Understanding
but
wife.
This isn't a real estate show, so we'll move on.
So they did this car up. John Markham, who was I knew reasonably well, described it. They'd all be sitting around, and he's like 7 or 8 years old, and he'd be polishing bits and pieces of metal and doing all that sort of thing. They put the car together, and then he took it around. He used to drive it about, and it was a bit of a thing back in the 1950s. That was
would have been. You couldn't give that sort of stuff away.
Yes,
would have been highly unusual then.
Highly unusual. And so once that was seen, other people started digging old cars out of their garages
and giving it to them.
And they were giving them to them. Saying, you're interested in old cars, so clearly, here, take my, whatever it was, a Model T Ford, a Model A Ford, and they had a whole bunch of those kind of cars, and a couple of Austin 7s and things. And it became a kind of a family thing. They started building up a collection that they'd all restore as part of, part of being a family.
And still having an understanding wife. Or she got off to South America.
No, she was quite understanding.
One yarn.
But then he began to really get into the classic car scene. He looked around and started attending auctions, especially over in the UK. And again, in those days, you could pick up a really rare vehicle for relatively little money.
But this is before the craze took off.
Yes, yes. So he picked up all kinds of things. Like he picked up, there was the Star, the 1898 Star, which is in the Motor Museum.
Yeah.
That came from an auction. There was a huge collection of veteran cars that was liquidated. And it was belonging to some Scottish lord or whatever. And when he passed away, to pay off all the taxes that they have in the UK, the family had to liquidate this amazing collection. So he picked up, that was one of the very special cars that they picked up. Several others were quite unique. There was the 1913 Nazaro, of which at the time there was only one in the world, and it had made its way out to Australia. If anyone
Would that be Italian, is it? Or
yes, the Nazaro.
It just sounds like it, that's all.
Felice.
Not even heard of that brand.
Yes, it was extremely rare. But Felice Nazaro was a Grand Prix race driver in the very early period, like 1903, up until about 1924. And he was regarded as being one of the best race drivers in the world. He won several of the Italian Grand Prix races. And he worked for Fiat. So he decided to step out on his own, and he started producing cars which were basically a copy of the Fiat, but with a little bit more racing power in the engine. A bit like the Lancia guy story, Vincenzo Lancia.
Yes.
But he wasn't very successful at it. He ended up going out of business after a couple of years. So they only built cars for 4 or 5 years. This car was 1913, which is the year that he won one of the Grand Prix in his own car, 1913 Type 3, I think, Nazaro. And he, the car had been in Italy, and somehow or other during the war had been seized or confiscated by somebody who ended up
Mussolini
bringing it.
probably had it for his entourage.
Wrong war.
Wrong war there.
Oh, what was this?
First World War.
Oh,
This is-
okay. Well, young Mussolini made me sit in the back seat.
Yes, and it ended up over here in Australia. Apparently, it had been converted to an ambulance at one stage, and it ended up on a farm. And then some guy found it. It was being taken to a wreckers yard,
Wow.
and it wasn't much of a vehicle at the time. And someone saw it and said, "Oh, I'll save
It was
that."
saved.
It was saved, and it sat in in the back of someone's house for years and years and years. Anyway, he ended up buying that. It was a unique vehicle, and it was one of the family's favourite vehicles. They did a tour in the 1970s over to the US, so they booked themselves a hire car to drive around in. But they also shipped the Nazaro to the US, and they
Right.
drove it all around.
Really?
Yes.
In America?
In
That'd be
America.
very interesting.
Yeah, which was quite an amazing achievement when you consider that it was a 1913 car. It's completely open topped. There's no roof or anything on the thing. So, again, I got most of this information from John Markham. He's a very talkative fellow when he was alive.
Oh.
But he said, so Mum and Dad, Percy and his wife, would be in the hire car with one of the sons, and John and one of his other brothers would be driving the Nazaro.
Having the real experience.
And they had a great time, and that was a very important car. When the collection was sold to the museum, that was one of the cars that they kept. So they didn't get rid of all of them. They ended up with a collection of about 45 vehicles.
Yes.
And for a period there, it was such a big collection that Percy had set up a private museum in Wembley, I think.
Yes.
It was called Antique Autos Museum.
This is in the 60s, Paul.
In the
60s, is it?
Yes,
Orders
yes.
Museum.
There aren't very many, because this internet didn't exist around those sort of times, so you don't find very many photos of it. It was written up as in an international vintage car museum book published in the mid to late 60s, and it was described as being the best vintage car museum in the Southern Hemisphere at the time. But it was too much to run at the end of the day. They had a marvellous collection of really, really rare and interesting things, and it became too much to run. So as Percy got older, he decided he would
Divest, if you
Pass it on.
divest, yes, but he wanted the collection, because the collection was such a good collection that he wanted it to be preserved for the people of Western Australia. So he did a deal with the West Australian government, offered it for sale at a kind of a notional price for the majority of the collection, including some motorcycles, and then the family kept some of the other vehicles that they didn't really want to get rid of for their own personal reasons. And then they ended up, the government bought the collection. The deal was very favourable to the government because they did a deal on an amount. It was to be paid off without interest over 5 or 6 years. And then Percy ended up donating most of that money back to expand the museum so that it could be
This was the WA Museum.
the WA Museum in Perth. And I can always remember going and seeing that as a kid when you walked into the ground floor of the new museum building, and there'd be all the cars would be there. It was one of my favourite parts of the museum exhibition.
Yes, I agree. You lost a lot of interest when you got the dinosaurs and things, didn't you?
Oh, and the blue whale was always
Oh, the
good
blue,
as
yeah.
well.
Well, that's
It's
and
currently under refurbishment.
and I'm back, and I'm back. The blue whale.
Yes.
Anyhow,
Yeah. Unfortunately, though, as we all know, another government came in at a later stage and looked at that collection. They had it valued, and of course, by that stage, vintage cars
Had gone up in leaps and bounds.
Gone up leaps and bounds. So again, some of these vehicles you couldn't hardly have given them away.
give them away, yeah.
And now they're worth substantial amounts of money. So 20 of the rarest and most expensive were put up for auction. And that led to a whole bunch of, like the classic car movement was outraged. Percy was still alive at that stage too.
A disgraceful decision.
Yes, and they just ploughed ahead and auctioned them off. I believe there was some sort of thing to say that they had to stay in the country, but that wasn't enforced, and most of those cars went overseas. The interesting one, I guess, is the Star, the 1898 Star. That was a highly desired car, and John, as I mentioned, he wanted that. He didn't want to let that one go. He wanted to keep it so that it could stay in the family, and they could do the London to Brighton run.
Yes.
So he went in and put a bid on it, and he bid through the auction, and he said it was his. And then some guy who was one of the high flying WA Inc. entrepreneurs, he says, waltzed in,
threw money at it,
with a young lady on his arm, wearing very, very scanty clothes,
and the auctioneer immediately,
I'll pay.
Whatever.
And it was like almost double.
He was out to impress.
Yes, and they of course went, yes, the car is yours. He immediately said he didn't really want it, so the auctioneers came back to John and said, well, you were the next.
Reality.
You were the next in line, so you can have it for what he was bidding, which is a little bit of an odd statement. But he said, no, I'll have it for what I bid.
Yes.
And they refused to accept it, that offer, and it ended up staying. It was the one car in the auction that did
stay in the state.
And it's now at the Motor Museum at Whiteman.
So indirectly,
it did stay.
It's
yes,
beneficial.
It was beneficial.
So of course this caused a lot of resentment and outrage in the classic car community, and I guess that in turn led to the establishment of our current Motor Museum.
Yes, that was one of the things that came out of it, which is disappointing that it had to end up being that way, but that was a good outcome. It brought the community together, and then the surviving cars that weren't sold, because they were only selling the high end. They needed a home to go to because they'd been taken out of the museum. And the Whiteman Park Motor Museum was formed, and some of them went there. Some of them are on display at the York Motor Museum as well, which is good.
Well, there you go.
So
what was Percy's occupation?
He was a property developer, I think.
Well, he was into real estate.
He was into real estate.
So the enthusiasm for cars definitely runs in the family, Paul.
Yes, I speak about John quite a lot, because he was actually, him and his brother Barry are both into classic cars as well, but also classic aircraft.
Oh, yes.
And both of them have done quite amazing, like round the world flights.
Really?
Barry Markham flew. He recreated one of the pioneering flights of flying in a Tiger Moth all the way from London to Perth.
Right.
In the 1920s.
That was a solo flight.
A solo flight. And he decided to do it backwards. So he'd go.
Game.
Yes, he's written a book about it, and you can find a couple of lectures.
But I did not realise that there was a relationship.
Yes, and again, John had done the first circuit of the world it was a two-engined plane, travelling from the US to Australia via the poles. Which is, it was called the wrong. There's a book on it called The Wrong Way Around. So he flew north across the North Pole, around the world, and then back up to.
So they were quite eccentric then.
Quite eccentric.
Or
and,
adventurous.
Adventurous.
But that's what brings in these people, isn't it? Okay.
Yes,
And that's, of course, that's carried on to you, of course.
Eccentric and but not quite as adventurous.
Yes, I haven't seen you driving any mainstream cars lately.
We talk about Holden. I'll put a little obscure link in there.
Yes, Paul.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we are going to talk about Holden, of course. The news came out this week that it's going to cease to exist as a mark, which is significant. I can't say that we were overly surprised. There wasn't a lot on offer, and they didn't seem to have run out of ideas. And obviously, you've got to feel very sorry for the smaller dealerships, especially the country dealerships, that have relied mainly on that mark. But life will go on. I'm guessing the older collectible Holdens may become even more sought after in the short term. But certainly the more recently manufactured Holden badge vehicles will be not worth very much money at all, I suspect, and there will be some screaming specials on offer to try and clear stocks. Of course, they had a very long history as a company. They used to make saddlery, horse equipment, let's call it, back in the 19th century in South Australia. And then around the time of the First World War, the Australian government of the day decreed that only chassis could be imported into Australia, and that we would encourage a bodybuilding industry by bodying our own vehicles on imported chassis. And Holden were one of the companies that proceeded to do that in about 1916 or 17 from memory. And then along came a chap called Lawrence Hartnett. He was an Englishman, but he was given the task of turning around the fortunes of a company after the Depression era in the 1930s, and did a very good job. And he, in fact, was the one that promoted the fact that Australia should have its own homegrown car. And as we know, the 48215, which had a six-cylinder, 2.1 litre engine, did hit the spot. It was exactly what Australian motorists were looking for at the time. And the best-selling cars were Standard Vanguard and the Austin A40 in the late 1940s. There was a Buy British scheme to support Commonwealth countries, and once they were able to make them in sufficient numbers, the Holden really did, I think it had more than 50% of the market share, which is pretty amazing when you think of it. And of course, Ford didn't arrive on the scene with local manufacture until 1960, so Holden did have the market all to themselves for quite a while. I'd have to say they didn't make any huge advances through the 50s. FC, FE, FB, EK still had the old grey motor. I think the EK was the first one to offer automatic transmission as a hydromatic, and it wasn't until 63, late 63, that the red motor arrived on the scene in the EH, and that was the best selling Holden of all time, with the exception of the HQ. And the EH and the subsequent Holdens did have a nice smooth six-cylinder engine, and they sold very well. So au revoir to Holden. Were you going to say something about Holden also, Paul?
Yeah, I'll tell a little obscure story. Of course, the government intervened in the war years about promoting the idea of a homegrown car because they realised how vulnerable Australia was.
Needed the manufacturing.
Needed manufacturing.
We didn't have it.
So they put together a commission to look at how can we build a car here without it becoming like an unsustainable industry. Because they were expecting that once we won the war, which of course was inevitable, American cars would come back, and so would the British cars. So an Australian car needed to be built very, very cheaply. So
but in Australia.
But in Australia. So how do you keep a low cost manufacturer going in the face of this sort of coming competition? Which of course is the problem that's occurred now. Is like, how could it keep building its own cars in an expensive environment when you can import them cheaper? So the commission that was looking at that in 42, 43 came up with a recommendation, and they said, we will build the cheap car that the DKW does in Germany. We'll take their car and engine as restitution after the war.
Oh yes.
And we'll move the factory here into Australia, because it was a popular little car that had no maintenance because of its two-stroke engine.
Is this where the Lloyd came in?
It did come in a bit later.
Yes. A bit later.
So the government then put forward a thing to like a request to the British authorities saying, when we seize the factory, the DKW factory, we'll have it shipped to Australia, thank you very much. But the DKW factory was in the Soviet area,
Eastern sector.
And then the Soviets said "Niet," so that was off the board. But Lawrence Hartnett didn't give up. He was over in the UK at the time, looking around trying to see what can we get, and he heard a rumour about a factory in the west side of Germany, in the British zone, that the British could not give away.
Yes.
So he went over and he looked at it and he came back saying, this car, rough, ready little thing called the Volkswagen, we'll take it in Australia. Pack the factory up, ship it to Australia, we'll manufacture it over there. The British themselves were not that keen because, as you just mentioned, it was by British after the war.
Yeah.
And they thought, if we give the Australians the ability to manufacture their own car, we're not going to be able to export our cars. So they stalled on the deal. And that was about 1946. In the meantime, Hartnett and then goes back and GM steps in and says, well, we'll help out and we'll form that thing.
And of course, significantly, VWs did go on to sell very well in Australia in the 50s. And right into the 60s.
And then they died
because
rather
they could
rapidly.
actually cope with the poor Australian roads of the time.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was the one thing that he was convinced about. He said that car will be able to tolerate Australian driving conditions. And when they ended up building the first 48 2 and 5, he was disappointed because it was very American. He said it won't handle Australian conditions as well. But they did. They eventually beefed it up, but they had to beef it up. So, in a different timeline, different set of circumstances, the Holden could have been the Volkswagen.
The Australian government were looking for a manufacturer worldwide, predominantly from America or UK, that could mass manufacture and switch immediately over to war, because with the Korean War looming up, with Russia and China and whatever heavy, they thought we're back into it again. And we need to have a mass manufacturer on our doorstep that could suddenly turn over to armaments. And that was one of the reasons to go that way. Well, they were courting companies that could have the ability to mass manufacture.
Yeah,
And we didn't have it homegrown.
A war economy.
That's right, it was.
We didn't have it homegrown, and now we no longer have it homegrown.
Once you took the subsidies away, they're out the door quick.
Well, that's a key thing.
They're
Right
only
from the
there when
beginning, in
subsidies.
1948,
They
it was
played a big part.
Big part, subsidies to keep the car going.
Industry going.
Yeah, industry going.
Although
But it
they-
got worse and worse, of course, because they just needed more and more subsidies
Well,
to keep
and only certain manufacturers got the subsidies as well.
Yes.
And so those that didn't, they were quite happy to let them go. And so there's a certain amount of subsidies. You're in the favourite. Anyhow, we'll move on, Rico. All right, okay, we're running out of time.
Paul, have a rest for a moment. I'll just speak for it.
You've got another 2 minutes.
I'm about to get kicked off the microphone.
You've got another 2
In
minutes.
that
I'll
case,
just do a quick,
we'll
at
do
the end,
a
yeah.
quick
Yeah, let's do the
promotion
promo.
on the
That's it.
Classic Car Show,
Yep.
which is Sunday, March the 8th.
Yes, huge record this year. We've got 78 car clubs coming. There's going to be a much bigger Holden turnout because all the Holden clubs seem to have, after the announcement, have gone, well, let's show up in bigger numbers and make a bit of a showing of it. Just a quick thanks to Shannon's, of course, for all of their assistance.
Yep.
Richard's Tyres, iTech World, which is a new sponsor we've got on board. They do jump starters, which in old cars is quite a very handy little thing to have in the back.
Oh, you can always use a
Because
crank
if
handle.
you don't have a crank handle,
Especially the first taste of winter.
rare spares. We're going to have a quick. Anyway, don't worry. I've forgotten what I was going to say.
What were we gonna
A
say?
raffle. There was a raffle and some really excellent prizes, including one of those battery pack chargers, coffee machine, and some other parts things. So come on down. It'll be great. It'll be a lovely day. Over 1,000 vehicles, all kinds of things. We can all reminisce about the demise of Holden.
And we will.
And
Yes.
admire all of the other many
Beautiful.
marks that are on display.
Beautiful. Thanks for coming up, Mark. That's very good.
Well done, Paul. Thanks very much for coming up once again. It was really interesting hearing about the history of the Percy Markham collection and how subsequently things panned out. I will just briefly mention, if Terry will let me, Saturday the 29th of Feb, that's 1 week today, there's a vintage rally up at Nungaran, which is in the wheat belt, just north of Meriden. It's on from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's $10 entry. There's everything vintage: cars, trucks, tractors, army tanks, military vehicles, and so much more. And then after dark, we're going to fire up a huge World War II anti-aircraft searchlight.
I hope that at night time, of course.
Yes, it will be. And you can stay at the old hotel in town called Macquarie's, and there's also the Woolshed Hotel or the local caravan parks. So that's next Saturday, the 29th of February, Leap Year Day, in Nungarran. Thanks very much for listening in to Round the Bend. Thanks to Paul for coming up as a guest, and thanks to Terry for manning the console.
Thanks,
We'll be here same
Thank you.
time next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.